So in this chapter, we're going to be looking at how CSS might be used within the design workflow, and also some of the ways that we can use graphic applications such as Photoshop and Fireworks to help us understand the type of markup and some of the CSS that we might be using to implement our design comps into full web page layouts with XHTML and CSS. So I want to talk to you through a little bit about my own design process. And here we have the final page design of worrisome.com, which we've been using for most of our examples. Now, just to flick back into some alternative tabs, just to show the process of this design. First of all, we start off here with some semantic markup. So if we have a look at the source code, again, I'm using the Web Developer toolbar. And here we can see that we've got our semantic XHTML with headers and paragraphs and lists. You'll also notice that we're using IDs on specific headers for things like image replacement, and also some IDs on the list items and anchors. So everything that we've been talking about up until now is included inside this document. If we have a look at this page with some basic position styling, we can see that we've taken that semantic markup and dropped that into a 2-column layout with a branding area at the top and a footer down the bottom.
Looks like you've got some other styles in there as well, starting to give it a little bit of...
Just a little bit of shape, some basic kind of text styles and position. And then into the final layout. And here we can see that everything that we've been talking about so far is here, with our branding areas and our navigation and some of these other design details. Now, it's interesting that when using CSS, it can be remarkably straightforward to replicate our original design comps as final web pages. In fact, I've noticed that my designs are far more accurately represented now with CSS layouts than they ever were with table-based layouts.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting phenomenon because for so many years, what we did in Photoshop or Fireworks, using tables, it was never going to be the same. We just never quite got the exact or close to the exact comp.
Well, this is a working web page, and again, it's in the source files directory, so that you'll be able to open this file and check it out for yourself. But yeah, you're right. We have all sorts of different techniques going on. But it's a working web page with clickable links. Interestingly, if we dive over into Fireworks, we can start to see how this design was built up. So this is actually a graphic comp of the design that we've worked on. And it's remarkably close to the final result. Now, my design process usually starts off by laying out what I call basic block work. So it's really setting the foundations for the composition. And often, printing these things off, scribbling notes about where things would go.
Do you ever start on paper?
The design process starts on paper, even before I move into electronics.
Yeah, I hear a lot of designers find that to be very, very useful if they sketch out ideas on paper and then move into the graphic environment. You feel that it's a good thing for most designers to do, or is it sort of a personal?
I think it depends on the context of what you're doing, and it depends on your own personal preference. So if we move from the block work through to the final example, I'm defining all of the original positions here before I start to add colour. Now, also, it's incredibly useful to have an intermediate stage between that, which is what I will call the wireframing stage. And it's in here that we can start to add more detail before we get through to the final comp. But it's at this point that you can sit down with the client and decide exactly what content is going to go in what place, what links are going to go where, what functionality there's going to be, what the form label names are going to be, etc. And interestingly, what I've done is I've created a whole bunch of Fireworks symbols. And these can be found in the library tab of the layout PNG file that's in the source folder for you. And here we can see that each main area has been created as a symbol. And I tend to work in a very modular way so that I can drag and drop symbols from one frame or one file to another. And it just makes the prototyping and the design phase very, very quick. But one of the most interesting things that I find about Fireworks is how we can use the symbols facility to be able to add markup actually inside our graphic documents. And if you use symbols as I do and have them have lots of reusable symbols, for example for forms or for headers or for navigation, which I'll store on a central server, then I can just pull them in to documents as I need them. And I also use the library items to add XHTML and sometimes even CSS markup there, just as reminders of the type of markup that we're going to be using when we finally come to make up the document. And it's also a terrific tool for bridging the gap between designers and coders, and also to help designers see through the visual and understand a little bit about what code is going to go behind. It's similar in a way to Dreamweaver's design view and code view. So if we have a look at some of these symbols, let me take a look at the experts list item here. So I'm going to double click on this and open up the edit window. And here you can see that what I've done is I've created two layers inside this symbol. So the first layer on the bottom is the design layer, where I'm going to be adding in all of the various elements and boxes that go into that. But I've created another layer over the top, which I've called XHTML. And on here, I've got my markup guides. So I'm adding in a little text reminder as to the sort of markup that I'm going to be using to make this panel.
So this is very interesting to me because you're the guy sitting there doing this, and you have the capability of both the visual design and the code. So in a workflow environment where, let's say, the visual designers and the coders or the web authors are separated, how would you work this? Who is going to be adding those guides?
I think it's got to be a matter of cooperation between the two sides. And often when we think about, for example, forms, when it comes to prototyping, dragging and dropping pre-designed, if you like, or pre-laid out forms can save an enormous amount of time. And that's the sort of thing where I would envisage that designers and coders would sit together and decide on what the most appropriate markup was going to be. And then they can be saved into that document. But it's very important that designers have an appreciation of the issues that coders may face when it comes to actually implementing that design, and vice versa.
Yes, absolutely. I was just going to say, as coders, we tend to think in details that are very different than the way visual designers think. The orientation is different. And I think it's, obviously the reason we are doing this title at all is to try and work on that problem. But I think when you've got workflow issues in a, medium to large size company, sometimes having these types of tools can be very, very helpful. I think that would be great to take a look at how you do a form, because what we're looking at right now is something that's obviously related to the design that we have been working through in this tutorial. But I think that it would be even clearer to the people learning that, if they saw like a form or something. So essentially you're creating like a globally used bit of information. So if I sit down and I have a new client, I can take these symbols, drag and drop them onto a page and actually make a page, right?
Absolutely.
And I'm carrying with me those markup guides, right?
Let's have a look at that. I'm just going to close this edit window down for that symbol. Before we move on to the form, I'm just going to click back into my frames panel here. And I've got my basic wireframe document which I'll be showing the client. But also I've got a duplicate of that where the symbols that I'm using have the layers for the markup turned on. So now if I flick over into that, we can start to see basically how this page is going to be marked up.
So when you do this, do you then save the whole design to a central server, and then people who are working, whether they're the visual designers or the coders, can be working on this separately from this particular document?
So let's open up a form example. Now these files are available in the source directory. So here I have my form PNG. And I have a basic form covering some of the topics that we talked about earlier on, with inputs and labels and field sets and divs. And also on another layer, some design. Now I find it very useful, particularly when we're talking about elements of a page which you're going to use again and again from site to site. I mean, forms or search boxes or perhaps tab navigation, something of that nature. To have the basic wireframe outlines in one frame, but then to work on it so that we have the design layer almost sitting underneath. So we can flick between the two. So if we have a look over here in our library, first of all, I'm going to create a new frame just at the end for the demonstration. Give that a name. So I've now got an empty blank frame. Move over into my library, and here are some of the markup and elements that we were using earlier on. So I can now drag that in. So a personal name field, perhaps an address field set, contact information. And these are very, very useful little snippets. And maybe even a submit button. So these are already predefined, and you can see how a symbol is denoted with the little arrow that appears in the bottom corner. So if we want to edit one of those and add some markup guides, what we can do is to double click on that symbol, which will open it up in an edit view. And over here we've got our layer in Fireworks, which contains all of the vectors that go into making up that element. So I'm just going to rename that one Design. And now I'm going to add a new layer by clicking on the new or duplicate layer icon at the bottom of the palette. And I'm going to rename that layer XHTML. Now the first thing that I would do in this case is to create an overlay. So I'm going to put a white overlay over the top of the design, and I'm going to set the opacity of that down to, let's say, 75%. So we can still see a little bit of the design elements coming through. And at that point, we can start to add our markup guides or reminders. So here, it's good practice to put the tags in. It's good practice to put any IDs that you know are going to be used. So we can put a field set in there and move that over the top. We can duplicate that and add a label. So we'll just copy that, make another one. Oop. We'll have one of those. And then you might remember from the previous examples how we used a span tag around the label text. So we'll just copy that. Now, some people might consider it sloppy, but when I add markup into my markup guides, I am often guilty of not closing the tags. So I think that it's not always necessary for a designer to, go to that amount of detail when it comes to making up these guides. But it's good practice to either stick to one discipline or another.
Yeah, these are essentially code hints is the way I would look at it. And it seems perfectly acceptable in a graphic environment to just give the hint. You don't need to show the closing tag as well, because the coder should know that that's what needs to be done. But I think, sticking to some consistency, don't open and close some things and then leave other things open. That gives, I think, a confusing message to the people who are working with you.
Absolutely. So now we can close down this symbol, and back in our design view, if you like, we can see that first field set with the markup guides overlaid. And it's just a case of repeating that procedure for lots and lots of reusable items that you might have.